All right. Well, I'm Mary Beth Gassman, and I am a professor at Rutgers University. It is a pleasure to be with you here today. I also serve as the executive director of both the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions and the Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice, and we are the sponsor of today's event. This event is part of a larger academic talk series that's called Let's Talk Humanities. It is funded by the Mellon Foundation, and we are incredibly grateful for that funding. And it is also part of a larger program that we have run called Hispanic Serving Institutions Pathways to the Professoriate. And we are really, really thrilled to have you here today for this talk, which is called The View from the Future Possible Science Fiction and Caribbean Histories. And we have with us an amazing speaker who I've had the opportunity to get to know a bit through our HSI Pathways program. Her name is Emily McGuire, and she is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Northwestern University, where she specializes in literature of the Hispanic Caribbean and its diasporas. She's also the author of Racial Experiments in Cuban Literature and Ethnography, and a brand new book, which is called Tropical Time Machines, Science Fiction in the Contemporary Hispanic Caribbean, and that is coming out shortly. Emily, I'd like to hand it over to you, and I just want folks to know that we would love to have your questions. So Emily's going to be presenting, and put your questions in the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many as we can. So Emily, take it away.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. And I want to really thank Mary Beth Gassman for this invitation. It's such a pleasure to get to share my work with the broader audience. I also want to thank Giselle Criollo and Natalie Pasov for arranging for this and for helping with the technology. So, The View from the Future Possible, Science Fiction and Caribbean Histories. I want to start with a story, a Caribbean story. In this tale, a transplanted Cuban, now living in a future New Jersey, packs his bag for a return visit to his birthplace. He leaves behind not only the genetically modified food and the neuronal interfaces, the implants and other body-altering technologies that connect him to his highly technologically advanced world in which he lives. For to return to his native land is also to travel back in time, to a place that is not yet connected to this technology. His trip home will not be by airplane in this story, but rather by time machine. Yet the traveler's return does not go as planned. Arriving at his destination, he decides to postpone any family encounters in order to satisfy his tourist fantasies. From his comfortable seat on a terrace, cool drink in hand, he gazes out at the colonial urban landscape of that ancient city once called Havana, when his eyes come to rest on a lone figure crouched in a doorway. The figure wears battered glasses and a heavy backpack. More significantly, they are staring fixedly at a tiny screen, immersed in cybernetic adventures. The protagonist immediately recognizes this person as a nerd, as he puts it, a kindred spirit to his own technologically inclined tastes. But the presence of this nerd is also a sign of how much has changed. He understands resignedly that if those ill-fated creatures, to whose mythology he now belongs, have been able to get all the way here, if they can coexist peacefully with the rest of the scene of sashaying mulatas with flowers on their hips, then for the rest of the laconic and befuddled travelers, as he claims to be, space-time has stopped being, will never again be steady ground. So this story, which is called Languid Epitaph for Time Travelers by Cuban writer Maelis González Fernández, uses a futuristic science fiction framework to taking the figurative positioning of the Caribbean as stuck in time and makes it literal fact. Geographic divisions in this future reality are not only spatial but temporal. Different access to and the use of technology places the island on a different temporal plane from New Jersey. Taking the idea of unplugging literally, the protagonist tries to escape the pace of his own technology-driven life by visiting a place that is stuck in another time and by adopting the special suspended time of the tourist. His escapist fantasy is shattered, however, when he realizes that the very elements that comprise his daily reality in New Jersey have reached the Cuban capital. The nerd leaning against the arch of a colonial building not only ruins the picturesque illusion of this fantasy, they also introduce an element of complexity into the simplified image of old Havana. If cyber surfing nerds can coexist with Cuban stereotypes from a colonial past, then the island's temporal separateness from the rest of the technologically advanced, digitally inclined world is an illusion. In truth, González Fernández's story slyly suggests this difference was always an illusion. The identification of this story as an epigraph declares that the kind of simplified, cliched experience the protagonist thought he was seeking is definitely over. So González Fernández's tale offers a critique of outside perceptions of Caribbean temporality. But it also serves as what I think might be an allegory for the changing place of science fiction in Hispanic Caribbean cultural production, which is what I want to talk to you more about today. Like the nerd in González Fernández's story, science fiction crept into Caribbean cultural production initially unseen and unannounced, but its presence across cultural media is now significant. The last 2 decades have seen a remarkable rise in the presence and visibility of science fiction in the cultural production of the Caribbean and its diasporas. The publication of science fiction novels and stories, both in print and online, has proliferated. And here are just a sampling of some of the most well-known anthologies and novels. Alongside the increasingly frequent use of science fiction elements in films, music videos, and visual and digital art. These are 3 films that I have looked at. Although science fiction may have previously been viewed as an isolated literary phenomenon, like the lone nerd hunched in a doorway, it is now clearly part of a much broader and more mainstream mediascape on the islands and in their diasporic communities. So why have Caribbean creators gravitated to science fiction as a mode of storytelling? This is the question that has been at the heart of my research for the last few years. And in my talk today, I want to think about how the genre speaks to the region's experience of our current moment. Despite their divergent political histories, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, the countries whose cultural production I examine, share certain characteristics in the world of globalized capital. In the last decades, all 3 have struggled with economic restructuring and with the significant, sometimes tragic impact of climate change on island environments. Each has increasingly relied on tourism as a primary source of capital. Each has impelled the growth of diaspora populations that both identify with and contest previous narratives of national identity. And each has seen the emergence of a community of writers, artists, and media creators who are engaging in what Josiana Arroyo terms, quote, their own critical dialogue with narratives of crisis, media exceptionality, and subjectivization, end quote. Science fiction has increasingly become a tool for engaging with this contemporary Caribbean landscape. In my forthcoming book, from which this talk is drawn, I argue that science fiction in the Hispanic Caribbean is significant for the ways in which the genre engages with temporality, with questions of time. By foregrounding science fictional elements, the hybrid texts that embody this science fictional turn in recent Caribbean cultural production articulate a shift in their narrative worlds, a move away from a world engaged with the past to a world that articulates a critique of the problems and concerns of the present from the point of view of futurity. Centering their future imaginings on the Caribbean, these recent science fictions work against the impulse of neoliberal globalization that seeks to delink time and place. The texts themselves function as time machines, projecting future Caribbean imaginings in which time and place are intimately connected. To understand the significance of science fiction's appearance in recent Caribbean cultural production, I think it helps to consider what constitutes science fiction in the first place. While mentions of science fiction often conjure images of spaceships or distant planets, scholars of the genre have shown that its narrative possibilities far exceed these elements. So Darko Suvin, one of the first critics who attempted definition of science fiction, identifies it as what he terms literature of cognitive estrangement. That is, the premise of a science fiction narrative may be completely unknown or strange, but it is developed in a way that for Suvin is coherent with what he calls the rigor of scientific systems. Yet Suvin and those that have followed his line of thinking understand science fictional texts as creating and inhabiting closed fictional universes. That is, within the universe, everything is coherent. In this sense, their conceptualizations of the genre to some extent fail to account for much recent cultural production from the Caribbean, where, in contrast to earlier examples of science fiction that identified themselves explicitly as genre fiction, recent literary and cinematic fictions employ science fictional elements alongside or in addition to other narrative modes, such as magical realism or the fantastic, sometimes in the same text. To understand how science fiction might be used in a text that does not adhere to a uniformly science fictional environment, I've made use of theories of science fiction that locate its difference in language and in narrative construction, such as those of novelist and critic Samuel Delany. Delany argues that science fiction constitutes not so much as a genre as a different mode of expression. So if realism can be said to describe what has happened or what could have happened, and fantasy describes what could not happen, something impossible according to our current logic, science fiction's difference, according to Delany, operates through the way in which it describes, with verisimilitude, events that have not yet happened, thereby expanding the relational capacities of descriptive language. Seen this way, science fiction might still be said to be a language that describes an experience or an existence beyond our day-to-day reality, but in the subjunctive plane of the future possible, rather than the dreamed or the imagined. So if other genres and previous iterations of Caribbean cultural production have positioned the region as exceptional or as outside of Western ideas of temporal linearity, occupying a repeating or static time, even anchored to the past, science fiction as a mode of narration acts to break this cycle, establishing a different relationship not only to the future, but to global understandings of history, temporality, and interconnectedness. The future possible intervenes in these cultural artifacts to highlight temporal stagnation, to make visible outmoded systems that continue to operate in the present, to offer alternative visions of Caribbean reality, both utopian and dystopian, it must be said, and to argue for radically new ways of envisioning both sociopolitical futures and the literary canons on which national identities and histories are built. Ultimately, I think these fictions attempt to break the reader or the viewer out of their own stuck ideas about Caribbean time and place. So in what's left of this talk, I want to explore two texts that use science fiction's future possible to explore and expose the constructed nature of both our experience of the present and our understanding of the past. So Puerto Rican writer Jose Pepe Liboy's novel El Informe Cabrera, or the Caba Report from 2008, and Cuban director Arturo Infante's film El Viaje Extraordinario de Celeste Garcia, Celeste Garcia's Extraordinary Journey from 2018, both take place in a present or future Caribbean. Yet in each of these texts, science fiction becomes a lens that troubles understandings of national histories and reframes the reader or viewer's perception of literary and cultural canons. Whether through a contrast between a future reality and a present one, or the insertion of science fiction's future possible in what was previously an established historical narrative, these texts call into question the fixity of the collective constructions the viewer or reader has accepted as reality. As they do so, they introduce possibilities for displacing, escaping, or altering national narratives, even when that possibility is frustrated in the individual text itself. Pepe Liboy's novel El Informe Cabrera, the Cabrera Report, begins as a letter from a Manuel Molina to his as yet unborn son. However, Molina's son's birth is not, it turns out, imminent. We learn that his son may not be born until perhaps 100 years after his father's death, through a scientifically engineered conception in an advanced center for embryology in Puerto Rico's interior. We are in a future Puerto Rico, one in which families use genetic engineering to combat increasingly prevalent birth defects, and where babies are planned and born in a laboratory deep in the mountains of the island. Given this futuristic scenario, it soon becomes clear that Molina's letter to his son will be more than a simple epistolary memoir. Indeed, alongside the personal narrative culminating in plans for his son's birth, Molina lays out another future genealogy, the creation of the report itself, a text he identifies as, quote, a novel of historical science fiction with something of biographical sensationalism, end quote. In the letters, notes, and other texts that make up his report, he elaborates a list of the precursors of this novel, creating his own retrospective genealogy of Puerto Rican science fiction. The corpus that he outlines includes 19th century authors whose work was never recognized as science fiction, as well as work from Liboy's own literary contemporaries. Molina's report on the planning and creation of his biological child thus becomes simultaneously a meditation on the tangled genealogies of literary inheritance, an exploration of the limits of genre, and a proposal for future creation, both biological and literary. Amidst the general strangeness of Liboy's novel, I find it significant that Molina identifies the text he is crafting as science fiction, an intentional gesture that I think sets both Molina's and through him Liboy's project apart from narrative techniques that run towards the more simply strange, like other members of his generation who have sort of identified themselves as iconoclasts. The characterization of the report as a work of historical science fiction highlights what separates this work from other narratives, deliberately identifying the text's changes or deformations and reflecting back to the reader the twisted elements of other, more consecrated histories. Science fiction's temporal characteristics allow both Liboy and his narrator to engage Puerto Rican history from the distance of a future possible rather than the present. Molina's twin narratives, that of his family's relationship to embryology and that of science fiction's presence in Puerto Rican literature, allow Liboy to highlight more sinister, yet equally hidden histories tied to America's control of Puerto Rico. By identifying his text and others as science fictional, Liboy thus offers science fiction to Puerto Rican literature as a kind of escape route, a new way of reading, and for him writing, Puerto Rican literature whose communicative capacities reach beyond mere realism. Tracing a canon of Puerto Rican science fiction within the novel, he suggests that this route is not a radically new one, but rather an already established, if hidden, local trajectory. From its first page, El Informe Cabrera reveals a preoccupation with origins, even as it works to complicate the idea of parentage. In his opening letter, Molina implies that he will proceed to sketch out a family tree. However, the letter and the documents that follow it reveal a family structure not organized by generation or bloodline. The first important person Molina names is his grandmother, but she will be important not only as a matriarchal figure, but also as an expert on embryology. When it becomes clear that Molina will need the help of science to produce a child, it is his grandmother who informs him that in spite of the family history of birth defects, which the novel calls deformities, it's never clear exactly what we're dealing with, he will be able to become a father. However, the mother that Molina's grandmother initially chooses turns out to be unable to conceive. And although another woman is introduced as the boy's future mother later in the text, it's not clear whether she will fulfill that responsibility either. The lineage that Molina thus begins to sketch remains hypothetical, indirect, and not yet realized. Molina further complicates the idea of genealogy by referring to both embryology and parentage as metaphorical states. He tells his son, "Experience will demonstrate that your destiny is more important than your blood. that true embryology has more to do with those who don't participate directly in your birth, but who are like silent parents, living shadows that surround you and who accompany you beyond visible experience, end quote. Here, Molina downplays the biological principles of genetic inheritance. Our formation as an individual, he suggests, has less to do with our cells and genetic makeup than with our psychic formation, with our emotional and spiritual processes of development. Just as Molina presents the reader with divergent conceptions of inheritance and family, it becomes clear that we are also dealing with two different ideas of embryology: the classically scientific practice, and another which might be identified as local or autochthonous. Molina relates that his paternal grandmother practiced embryology, he uses the word, together with espiritismo, Puerto Rican spiritism, and that she considered the island's embryology, quote, a custom, a folkloric aspect of our island. Thanks to its orality and its connections to espiritismo, this second local embryology operates as a secret practice, visible but not perhaps officially recognized. To think of embryology in this way asks the reader to expand their understanding of what science can be. In contrast to the linear temporality of Western scientific experimentation and testing, the suggestion of a spiritist embryology suggests a more fluid production of knowledge and the construction of a set of relationships that may be less linear than rhizomatic. In subverting common narratives of heredity and expanding the definition of embryology, Liboy is playing with a regional fascination with what Rudyard Alcocer has named hereditarian discourses. Alcocer argues that Caribbean literature evidences a preoccupation with, quote, kinship, biological origins, and/or racial purity, such that relationships of heredity and dependence pervade areas not commonly associated with these relationships, end quote. By decoupling embryology from heredity, which, as Alcocer notes, operates within a linear temporal framework, Liboy opens the door for thinking about time in general in more flexible ways. If we are not locked into our heredity, we are not locked into other linear relationships of cause and effect. Although Liboy's text never mentions race explicitly, it's hard not to think that by privileging non-consanguine relationships, he is sidestepping the Puerto Rican fascination with ideas of racial purity that Alcocer mentions. Through Molina's discussion of a local Puerto Rican embryology, Liboy also engages with the history of family planning on the island and its relationship to U.S. colonialism. Historian Laura Briggs argues that since the United States seized control of Puerto Rico at the end of the 19th century, quote, reproduction and sexuality have defined the difference that makes colonialism in Puerto Rico possible and necessary, end quote, for the U.S. On consolidating control of the island following the end of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. leadership in Puerto Rico instituted a series of both political and social control mechanisms intended to discipline and subjugate Puerto Rican bodies. These practices included a concerted effort to control the birth rate on the islands through education on family planning and birth control. One of the most politicized methods of birth control was female sterilization. And by the mid-1960s, Puerto Rico had one of the highest documented percentages of ever married sterilized women in the world. As Briggs has shown, both female fertility and family planning became hot-button issues in the political debates dealing with Puerto Rico's relationship to nationalism, capitalism, poverty, and even modernity. El Informe Cabrera returns to the controversial issue of family planning on the islands, only to present the ironic reverse of the historical situation. If political powers, both external, read the US, and internal, struggled to control female fertility and female bodies in the 20th century, Liboy's novel defines embryology, and implicitly family planning, as a local autochthonous practice, characterized by elements like spiritism that have no connection to official external science. Instead of showing us a national birth rate that is out of control, the text presents us with a family who has struggled, apparently for generations, to produce healthy offspring. The novel replaces the secret of forced sterilizations with a secret laboratory in San Sebastián, the town in the western part of the island where Molina's son will be conceived and brought to term. This fictional laboratory occupies the former site of the Central Sorier, once a large sugar plantation. What was the center of a US-controlled agricultural industrial power in the early 20th century will now be refashioned in this tale for another kind of biological reproduction. Even as Liboy's text proposes the existence of a national Puerto Rican embryology, the novel explores the connection between this science and literature. In Molina's narrative, the story of the artificial conception of his son becomes completely interwoven with the idea and practice of literary creation. As Molina himself admits, quote, "I can't help but compare the ideas of scientific embryology with those of literature," end quote. It soon becomes evident that the connections between literature and embryology for Molina are as much about method as they are about coincidental closeness. The series of documents that Molina compiles for his son, rather than a collection of official documents or scientific texts, turns out to consist of a proposal for a novel, also entitled El Informe Cabrera, and the correspondence between Molina and a series of writers and literary critics, many of whom are real and are actual interlocutors of Liboy, and an elaborate bibliography of writers and texts that deal with embryology or genetics. As it happens, these are also the texts that Molina will recognize as examples of Puerto Rican science fiction. The appearance of embryology that Molina finds in these texts thus serves as a trailblaze that guides us to a particular way of reading. They show us how Molina, and through him Liboy, intends science fiction to be used as an altered way of seeing and reading. So here I'm going to take a slight detour because I want to zero in on one of these examples of science fiction that Molina finds. The first writer that Molina recognizes as someone who has explored the topic of embryology is Pablo Morales Cabrera. Morales Cabrera was a real writer. He was born in 1866 and active until the 20th century, and he's best known as a writer of short fiction. Molina's characterization of Morales Cabrera as the first writer of embryology is particularly interesting and slightly unusual if we look at the specific stories that Molina identifies as dealing with this science. In The Kleptomaniac, a kleptomano, one example he cites, Indalecio, a man of humble background, arrives in a town with dreams of ascending the social ladder. He becomes involved with an attractive young widow, who also happens to be financially well off. Yet when the widow acts as though she might be pregnant, only to suddenly become noticeably thinner, everyone in town not only suspects that Indalecio may have been the father, but also that he may have helped the widow to get rid of the baby. When a few townspeople discover Indalecio burying something one dark night, they assume it is the child's body, and they have Indalecio arrested. In the end, however, they discover that the body is nothing more than a doll, which Indalecio, revealed as the kleptomaniac of the title, has stolen. Although Indalecio is eventually freed, the scandal and his penchant for theft rob him of his dreams of becoming one of the town's elite. So this is Morales Cabrera's story. But where, one might ask, is the treatment of embryology in the story? The text's only possible connection to embryology appears in the first description of its protagonist, which is this, quote, "Poor Indalecio. I believe he never had a mother. He was born of a spore and grew like a mushroom. But if a botanist had cataloged him, he would have included him among the venomous species," end quote. This description is repeated twice, once at the beginning of the story and once at the end, with the addition of this statement at the end that Indalecio, quote, "was already classified as a parasite." So if one reads these statements in a realist mindset, it seems clear that the description of the story's protagonist is a metaphor. Indalecio is so alone in the world, it is as if he had been born without a mother, living or present, as if he has no visible connections to a past. The observation is redolent of classist and potentially racist assumptions. By having arrived out of nowhere, Indalecio has no family who can vouch for him. He is a nobody, aspiring to a social position the narrator at least implies he does not merit. Molina, however, Liboy's narrator, seems to intend this quote to be read literally. Indalecio is not the product of the human process of conception, but instead has been produced asexually by spores. If this is the case, then his kleptomania has nothing to do with his family background and everything to do with the scientific, literally non-human way in which he was conceived. Reading the description of Indalecio as if it were literal generates a completely different meaning. Indalecio doesn't act the way he does for psychological reasons, but because he has literally been bred this way. He is something other than human, a new kind of being. There's a kind of weird post-human dimension to this reading. His story shares with the laboratory creation of Molina's future offspring, a rejection of classic models of human reproduction and heredity. By reading science fictionally, this example suggests we can reveal a multiplicity of alternative stories and histories in Puerto Rican literature. By identifying the kleptomaniac as science fiction, Molina is not so much recognizing a particular way of writing as he is proposing a particular way of reading. As he observes, quote, "A novel explicitly about embryology wouldn't work. The game is to discover texts where the hidden subject has not been developed. To read from a science fictional perspective transforms the meaning of even well-known texts, bringing to the surface a series of previously unrecognized concerns and tendencies. Reading from this science fictional perspective allows Liboy to construct a new canon from a corpus of classical texts. It also helps him to identify a community of contemporaries, to establish a dialogue with other Puerto Rican writers. The many letters that appear as part of the novel's fabric reveal an active correspondence between Molina and contemporary writers like Pedro Cavilla, Yara Lisiaga, and Carlos López Zur. These writers serve as a community for Molina, and really for Liboy, either because their writing makes possible a shared way of reading, or because they too are reading from a point of view that doesn't follow the expectations of ordinary realist narrative. By tracing the outlines of this community, Molina lays out a future genealogy for Puerto Rican science fiction, signaling to his companions on this literary journey. So Liboy's novel wants to rewrite the past because it wants to re-envision the future. The novel's socio-political critique is also fundamentally a literary invention and vice versa. The characteristics that will shape Molina's future child, as he has described it, are as much literary and cultural as they are scientific. What Molina, and through him, I think, Liboy, desires to create is not only a new flesh and blood son, but also a new kind of text, both of which will be marked by play and deviation more than by origin. Thus, the need to go back to rewrite the history of Puerto Rican science fiction. By inserting deformations into our reading of the past, other science fictions are made possible in the future. If Puerto Rican reality is full of distortions, then the alteration of these alterations can offer new solutions, a new way of reading the islands and their cultural history. So, moving on, Arturo Infante's El viaje extraordinario de Celeste Garcia begins with the revelation of an illusion. To look at the sky is to see the past, says Celeste Garcia, Maria Isabel Diaz, the film's protagonist. A guide at the Havana Planetarium, she is explaining to a planetarium audience how the light from distant stars must travel millions of light years before becoming visible from Earth. And I'm just going to show a very brief clip. Unfortunately, this is the only subtitled version of this. Let's see if it'll work. There we go.
Quiero que cuando vuelvan a mirar al cielo, vean lo que realmente es. Un misterio del que todavía sabemos muy poco.
Desde hace ya varios años, Nuestro planeta ha recibido una numerosa delegación perteneciente a una civilización extraterrestre. La civilización.
So the constellations that we see in the night sky are actually a reflection from the past, finally arrived in our present. Yet seeing the past made as the present as the past made visible might be an accurate description of Celeste's own life. A shy, mousy, and late middle-aged widow, she has never recovered from her years of marriage to an abusive husband, a situation that forced her to leave teaching, her real love and vocation. As a planetarium attendant, she hides behind the shapeless formality of her company uniform, the severe bun in which she wears her hair, making her look older than she is. The film's opening scenes show her going through the motions of her daily routine, which takes her back and forth between work and her Centro Habana apartment. Yet Celeste's declaration at the beginning of the film could also be an ironic commentary on Cuba's own situation. The remaining socialist nation in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba's economy has never completely recovered from the challenges of the special period, when it lost its favored trading relationship with the Soviet bloc, when the Soviet bloc dissolved. Although it does not depict Havana as a ruin, as a long cinematic tradition does, the cinematography in Infante's film lingers on the age of the city. The faded colors of a city street, the rugged faces of elderly men playing dominoes, the peeling plaster walls of Celeste's apartment. The material decay points to a place in which the past has become the present, in which the new, and especially the new and welcome, is rare. But Celeste's uneventful existence changes one night when she is awakened to the sounds of her neighbor, Paulina, leaving in the company of some strange-looking people. The next day, a government news broadcast, which we started to hear, explains this unusual nighttime departure. Aliens from a distant planet, Grioc, have been living among the Cuban population for years, disguised as ordinary citizens. They have now returned to Grioc, but in a gesture of thanks for the hospitality of their Cuban hosts, the Griochites have invited a select group of Cubans to visit their planet. Celeste discovers that the strange card Paulina slipped under her door before leaving is in fact an invitation to form part of the delegation to Grioc. She suddenly has a chance to leave everything she has known to travel to a distant planet. With its introduction of alien visitors and space travel, El Viaje Extraordinario takes one of the most common tropes of Cuban cinema, the question of whether or not to emigrate, and gives it a provocative and expansive new twist. So the decision to leave the island and the expectations and fantasies of those preparing to leave have been the subject of everything from feature films, and here's just a selection, especially from the early 2000s, Nada Más, Havana Blues, and Personal Belongings, to the more recent Últimos Días en Havana, to documentaries, to the zombie movie Juan de los Muertos. If emigration has always meant leaving the known and familiar for the unknown, the option to travel to a different planet exponentially opens the dimensions of possibility. What does it mean to leave behind not only your own country, but also your own reality for a world that is quite literally alien? Brief clips in the film reveal the current situations of the people who will be Celeste's future travel companions. A pregnant woman struggling to relax in her small wood frame house, an aging tango singer at a nightclub. All of them are eager to give up their current life for the possibility of a new and different future. Just as the announcement of a new planet is reorienting Cubans with dreams of escaping their island reality, the science fictional twist in Infante's film begins to shift the viewer's perspective. The revelation that aliens have been living among us opens a space for a strangeness and difference in what were expected narratives and visual scenarios. Although much of the film's cinematography captures ordinary elements of daily Cuban life, the information that aliens exist imbues even the most quotidian of scenes with the possibility of the unexpected and unimaginable. Could reality, ordinary reality, in fact contain things beyond our conception or perception? The viewer begins to inspect each scene for signs of things that are other. The machines that the government agents use to examine Paulina's apartment make noises that sound like robots or spacecraft. Prospective travelers to Griok look like aliens themselves when they don headsets that allow them to view the planet's larger-than-life wildlife. The possibility that the strange and the novel might be contained in the familiar shifts the viewer's approach to images that might otherwise be seen as cliché. Infante's film is, at its core, a comedy in the guise of a travel narrative. Even as the viewer is awakened to the potential for the unexpected or unexplained in the formally ordinary, the film makes fun of the way in which Cuban state bureaucracy assimilates what should be the most radical of events into the governmental machine. The trip to Griok, as an official visit, becomes a bureaucratic event. Celeste's fellow travelers will be chosen by lottery. The government thus sets up offices for interplanetary travel, where people can register for the lottery, and Cubans join long lines outside these offices just as one might wait in line for the bus. As part of the official preparation for their interplanetary trip, those chosen as part of the Cuban delegation must travel by train to a special training camp, where they receive instruction on the basics of life on Griok and practice getting on board the spaceship, an endeavor that must be carefully timed since the ship can only land for 30 minutes. The bulk of the film's action thus takes place at the training camp, which happens to be the site of a former country school, or Escuela al Campo. Begun in 1965 and very active through the end of the 1980s, the country schools brought urban high school students to the countryside to perform agricultural labor in settings that were certainly institutional, if not close to carceral. Once at the training camp, the Griok-bound Cubans are assembled in military lines, given electronic bracelets that will be their tickets onto the spaceship, and assigned to one of 3 dormitories. They're kept to a rigid schedule of physical exercise, lessons, and meal times, and must remain in their rooms after lights out. The move to the training camps stimulates a pleasant sense of anticipation in the viewer, a feeling enhanced by the introduction of a romantic plot twist. Augusto, a butcher at Celeste's neighborhood meat market, happens to have scored a seat on the spaceship to Griok. Augusto has clearly had his eye on Celeste for a while. In one of the film's early scenes, we witness him trying to make conversation with her at the market as he helps her with an order. These new circumstances spur him to more direct action and give Celeste the freedom and space to reciprocate. The two exchange flirtatious banter in the dining hall and later escape from the training exercises to share a clandestine conversation. Although Celeste remains coy, it's clear that she is pleased to receive his attentions. Even as they heighten the viewer's sense of anticipation for the journey to Griok, the scenes at the training camp also set up the film's central joke. The longest journey that the viewer will witness in the film is the trip to the training camp itself. When one of Celeste's bunkmates dies of a heart attack during a practice drill, his place on the spaceship is taken by Junior, a young man who reminds Celeste of her own son. Unbeknownst to Celeste, however, Junior has bribed his way into being the first on the wait list, and is also looking for a way to steal his girlfriend onto the flight as well. When the siren announcing the spaceship's imminent arrival sounds, he sees his chance. He knocks Celeste out and steals her bracelet, leaving Celeste herself tied up in a closet. Although the guards are alerted to the crime and Celeste is freed, it turns out to be too late. She runs out onto the airfield just in time to see the ship, presented on screen via CGI, as a kind of giant cephalopod in spaceship form, in liftoff. In a subversion of the science fiction trope in which an encounter with extraterrestrials proves to be a moment of consciousness expansion or epiphany, Infante's film turns out to have been setting the viewer up for an epiphanic experience that never happens. There is no interstellar journey shown in this supposedly science fiction film. Celeste's trip to Griok has only taken her as far as the next province. By a twist of fate and a question of seconds, Celeste has missed her chance to leave Cuba and start over. But would this new start have been the happy opportunity she imagined? Even as it plays up the hopes and dreams of the travelers, Infante's film includes details that cause the viewer to wonder whether this encounter will turn out exactly as advertised. At no point in the film do we meet an undisguised inhabitant of Griok in the flesh. We see only a few short takes of the spaceship's exterior. We never learn what happens to the Cuban travelers after they are sucked into the ship's depths, nor do we glimpse the ship's interior or its crew. The film's most sinisterly suggestive moment occurs when a strangely dressed, wild-eyed man, played by Jorge Molina, who has found his way onto the training camp, confronts some would-be passengers in a hallway and urges them not to board the spaceship. He screams, "All of you, open your eyes! The Griochites are allied with the reptilians! Don't get on the spaceships! They're going to suck your brains!" Given the man's appearance, it's easy to dismiss him as mentally ill, a spreader of meaningless conspiracy theories. Yet the disruption he creates opens a space for considering alternate versions of the travel scenario. What if the information the Cubans are receiving at the training camp is all propaganda? Is Griot truly an advanced, nearly utopian civilization, or could the Griochites have ulterior motives for their hospitality? In his conversation with Celeste, Augusto also expresses some skepticism about the training they are receiving. He tells her, quote, "I still don't believe it, Celeste. Maybe because I'm used to hearing that when something's too good, it's best to run away." End quote. Finally, Celeste awakens the morning after the spaceship's departure to discover that the traveler's luggage is still piled up next to the landing strip. Was this an accidental oversight? Are these earthly possessions incompatible with life on Griot? Or is this a sign that the travelers to Griot are destined for a situation in which they won't be needing their belongings? Whatever the answer to these questions, Infante leaves open the possibility that this emigration journey is other than what it appears. The viewer never learns what awaits the travelers to Griot, but we see how evidence is marshaled so that when the ship arrives, we too are ready, like Celeste, to believe in the possibility that Griot is real, even if we question that the trip could be everything she dreams. When the Griochite spaceship departs without her, Celeste must return to Cuba. If the stars remain inaccessible, however, it turns out she is not the only traveler who did not go to Griot. Augusto, on realizing Celeste was not on board the spaceship, forced the Griochites to let him off. He reconnects with her and invites her out to his farm for the weekend. "I'll treat you like a queen," he tells her, to which her playful response is, "Mas te vale, you'd better." With this hopeful romantic ending, Infante's film seems to offer yet another play on the viewer's expectations. Celeste's extraordinary journey has been less a trip into space than a voyage towards self-confidence, love, and hope for the future. Despite the simplicity of El Viaje Extraordinario's romantic arc, however, I don't think we should dismiss the importance of the film's science fictional elements. Although she never leaves Earth, the presence of Griot as a space of possibility is what grants Celeste and the film's viewers the distance from which to observe her current surroundings. The existence of the extraordinary and the possibility of meeting it changes the perspective, disrupts known trajectories. That Celeste and Augusto find each other after not boarding the spaceship is qualitatively different than if they had begun a relationship without ever leaving their neighborhood. It is different to have taken leave, to have let go and to have returned, than to have never left at all. So here, just some concluding thoughts about these two texts. Through the introduction of science fictional elements, Libois and Infante's narratives destabilize established ways of viewing Caribbean history and reality, revealing the constructed nature of these concepts. This does not mean their individual visions are completely liberatory or utopian. Infante's films cast space travel, or at least the visit to Griot, as a dubious solution to what ails its Cuban protagonists and implicitly Cuba more broadly. And while Libois' novel is suggestive of the ways in which both Puerto Rican literature and Puerto Rican scientific narratives can be rewritten and expanded, it also highlights the scars of the island's colonial relationship to the US and the challenges of recovering from this history. Yet by estranging the reader from previous assumptions of what is real or possible, these texts create a space for further reflection on the way in which other stories are told, on the accepted norms of possibility. The contrast they establish between these alternate realities and our present expand the reader or viewer's idea of what is possible, or not yet possible, creating a space for things to be and to be seen otherwise. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Emily. That was terrific. I really enjoyed listening to you and learning. We've got some questions, so want to ask them. The first one is folks are interested in what motivated you to get into this kind of work. I think that's always a good question, especially for students, but for all of us.
Yeah. And I think, as with many people, I found my way to science. I had been a fan of science fiction as a kid, and had sort of, but was not a dedicated fan, had moved away from it, and found my way to Caribbean science fiction by chance. I was in Cuba in 2001 doing dissertation research, and a friend, we were in a bookstore, and he put a book in my hand and said, "This is a really good story." And I didn't know anything about science fiction in the Caribbean. I didn't know it was there. And this was a novel it's a novel called La Estrella Boca Arriba, The Upside Down Star by Raúl Aguiar, which is not quite science fiction, but he's someone who's very active in the science fiction community. And that was what started me on it. This has been an interesting project because when I began, things were just, I've been working on, I read that book in probably 2007, was published in 2001. And since I began working on science fiction, the corpus, the number of things, films, novels, short stories, has just exploded. So when I started, it was, especially in Cuba, has a longer tradition of science fiction than Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic. But even in Cuba at that point, it was kind of a small scene. And it was still a little bit confined to kind of genre fiction. It was still a little bit ghettoized. And since then, it really has expanded out into more mainstream literature. The scene is still very active. But it's expanded out into mainstream literature, science fiction in Puerto Rican literature and film, and has just exploded. And the Dominican Republic, just in the past, 6 or 7 years, has had a scene sort of explode. So it's been fun to be on the sidelines as things are developing in real time.
Yeah, I also love the idea that this interest started when someone handed you a book, because I think that's such a common experience that happens to people, is that, I mean, I hope that people realize as they're banning books and attacking libraries that books are so important to us all, So you talked a little bit about a community of Caribbean writers and creators exploring science fiction. How do you see them as a community, and are there any connections between like the three islands, for example?
So that's been one of the most exciting things to watch happening, because I think that certainly when Cuban science fiction has a, as I mentioned, has a slightly longer tradition. It had a very active moment in the first years of the revolution in the 60s, and then the revolution went through a period of very intense censorship in the early 70s called the 5-year Gray Period, and it sort of went underground and then came back in the 80s and 90s. But when I was first getting into it, it was, Cuban writers were technology was much more difficult. It was hard. It was much harder to get a sense of who was writing what, where. Fostering connections was hard, and in part thanks to the internet and thanks to the facilitation of technology and the increased access to the internet in Cuba, which has also been a thing. Those kinds of connections have really exploded. And so the last few years have seen a lot of actual, not only dialogue, but actual collaboration between writers and artists in Cuba, the DR, and Puerto Rico. So this past weekend, for example, there was the 7th Caribbean Science Fiction Conference, which was held this time not in Havana, but actually in Santiago de Cuba on the eastern part of the island. There have been the previous 6 were held in San Juan, and then one was held jointly in San Juan and Santo Domingo. So there's been and several anthologies have come out of these collaborations. So it really is now, I feel like, much more first, at least for certain, for certain communities, there is a real kind of exchange and dialogue about what constitutes Caribbean science fiction. There's a really active debate about what constitutes Caribbean futurism or Caribbean Afrofuturism.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. It seems like it's, really, really rich and growing rapidly, which is great. So, and connected to that, science fiction, which, by the way, my daughter loves and I am baffled by, seems to be, really popular generally, right? And I guess one of the things I'm wondering for people listening, is there anything specific or particular or unique about Caribbean science fiction that is, that stands out in a way that we might notice?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And one that I'm still, I go back and forth. I love when it comes up because I have varied answers to it. In some ways, I think that Caribbean science fiction is picking up on a certain kind of anxiety and interest in the future possible that I think is in the ether, right? Certainly elsewhere in Latin America, there's been a similar explosion of science fiction and also literature that we might call speculative fiction in a more, being less. In my work recently, I've insisted on science fiction, but the term speculative has a sort of broader reach. So I think it's picking up on some of these more general anxieties. On the other hand, the Caribbean really is front and center for certain kinds of urgent debates. One of them is, it is deeply affected and very vulnerable to climate change. And so there are increasingly more narratives that either deal with questions of climate change and climate, or are a number of narratives that are sort of post-apocalyptic scenarios, exploring what that might, what a kind of post-apocalyptic climate change future might look like. So that's one thing. There are also ways in which certain tropes from science fiction have a very Caribbean resonance, like the zombie figure, for example, is has been taken up everywhere, but it comes from the Caribbean, and it has a very particular historic resonance in a Caribbean space.
Oh, thank you. Those are actually really good examples that I might not have thought of. And I thought that link to climate change is really interesting too. So thank you. Well, that is all the time that we have for questions today. I want to say thank you to our attendees. And Emily, thank you so much for sharing your work. I think it's really, really exciting. Good luck with the new book. I think that should be great, and I'm hoping that we'll see even more coming out from you in the future. Just want to say thank you to our staff at the Proctor Institute and the Center for Minority Serving Institutions. And just to let everyone know, we did record this, and if you registered, which of course you did if you're here with us, we will be sending it out to you. So thank you so much, everyone. Take good care.